And Theodore is going to start us off by sharing some words.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to read a brief reflection on apocalypse. Apocalypse is a rite of passage. For millennia, we've watched our children come into the world and cut the umbilical cord, recognizing that this is an act that has repeated itself and will repeat itself countless times. From singularity, new forms arise that become separate from the mother who birthed them. Paradoxically, this very insight teaches us that we are never really separate. Our shamans learned to break through the cosmic barrier to reveal new ways of understanding our place in the universe. And we celebrated the passage of time, birth, coming of age, death, with our rites of passage celebrations. In the apocalyptic moment, we experience a collective rebirth, a collective rite of passage. We break through the cosmic barrier to uncover a new cosmology, a new consciousness. We can only approach this edge with an honest unknowing. To pretend otherwise is to court the hubris that has brought with it so much trouble in the first place. We must also do so with a sense of genuine power, not the power of false and shrunken egos that need to own a world that they cannot feel a part of, but the power of people who bring with them an entire cosmos of wisdom, the power of a people who come from the stars and can make worlds with their words, their minds, their hands. At the edge of the world, we must find also the courage to leap into the abyss, knowing that there's no alternative but to be reborn.
Beautiful, powerful, thank you. Y'all ready to leap into the abyss and be reborn together, and to reimagine together? Let's do it. So y'all, if you do not know Theodore and Ramon, we are in the presence of some of the great visionaries of our time. These are two human beings that I know personally, who I learned from, who I look to. So yeah, we're really honored to be in their company today. And thank you both for joining us. I want to just take a short moment to introduce you each, and then we're going to just jump right into it. And most of our time is going to be just hearing from you all, being in conversation. So Theodore, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to just read a short bio. Theodore Richards is a philosopher, a poet, and a novelist based in Chicago. He's the founder of the Chicago Wisdom Project and Wisdom Projects. He's also the editor of an online magazine called Reimagining Education and Culture. And his work is dedicated to reimagining education and creating new narratives about our place in the world. He's the author of many books, but most relevant, he wrote a book a few years ago called The Great Reimagining Spirituality in the Age of Apocalypse. That passage he just shared, I believe, is from that book. And then most recently, he wrote a book called A Letter to My Daughters. And of course, he's a father of 3 children. He's a husband. And yeah, he's a great gift to us in the world today. So Theodore, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
And our second guest is Ramon Gabrieloff-Parish. And Ramon is someone who I've known for a long time. Yeah, someone who's very dear to my heart. He is a visionary educator based on the Front Range of Colorado. He's developed a pedagogy that synthesizes mindfulness, embodiment, social justice, the environment, mentoring, and ritual and ceremony. He's been growing this over the last decade. He currently teaches at Naropa University. He's a leader and a facilitator in a body of work called the Surfing the Creative International Youth Leadership Camps. And he's a member of the Youth Passageways Network. Ramon is also a husband. He's also a father of 3. And Ramon, you're someone who I cherish deeply. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah. All right, let's jump into it. So we want to start with just like the big picture, this current moment that we find ourselves in. Um, just in the last few weeks, we've shifted from a health crisis centered around COVID-19 to suddenly opening up to a deeper recognition of the pandemic of racial justice, right? Sparked by the death of George Floyd and many others. And really, we find ourselves in a new moment, really, that's centered on systemic racism in this country, the long history of it and its current realities. We are amidst like historic uprising, and we're in a movement moment that is like just, it's filled with so much possibility. There's so much shifting and stirring and sparking, and I'd love just to hear from each of you. Like, what's your take on what's happening? What's opening up? What's unfolding? Where are we? Theodore, let's kick it off with you.
Yeah, I think that was a good summary. I think that I would tend to look at both the uprisings that we've seen recently and the pandemic as well as really just simply pieces of a longer and broader set of crises and possibilities that we're finding ourselves in. I mean, I think that, I describe this as an apocalyptic moment, by which I mean it's a moment when there's a general experience I think people have of being unmoored and feeling like their place in the world is no longer what they thought it was. And so this requires us to rethink really who we are and the basic kind of narratives and stories about what it means to be a human being. This was true before the pandemic, and the pandemic has kind of like shined a light on so many, even in my own personal life, I feel like just being at home with my family longer, it's like, it feels like this is more opportunity to kind of like really look at myself, how I'm living my life, all the kind of, relationships within my family. And then it's an opportunity to rethink those things. But I think that what the pandemic has brought out for me, and I think part of the reason why this uprising now with George Floyd, this is certainly a horrific incident, but it's one of countless incidents. Why now? Partly because the pandemic is shining a light on it. And I think if we look at the kind of myriad crises that we have been finding ourselves in, from the rise of fascism worldwide, which is like a fear of the change and a clinging to the control, to all of the kind of like, problems associated with climate change. I think that it's a moment of crisis and possibility, a moment of apocalypse, which for me is what I would describe as like a moment where the stories that we had about who we are no longer working for us. And we have to reimagine those stories and figure out who we are again and what our place in the world is.
Beautiful. Ramon.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of keep running with this theme of apocalypse. There's been this term that's come out, slow violence, and it's kind of referring to these large-scale patterns of structural violence that unfold over a length of time that's so long that if you're not paying attention, you can mistake like the pattern for a bunch of discrete events. And I feel like that's kind of how this apocalypse is happening. It's a slow violence or a slow apocalypse. It's a slow revelation. And it's like all of these like massive shocks, which I think the business as usual mentality wants to say, oh, that's just happening. Oh, that's just happening. When it's really like when the pandemic first dropped, I was like, because I feel like in a way we've been aware, many of us have been aware of this slow apocalypse. I've been aware of it at least since the middle 90s. And yet, like, this was an event where I was like, oh, wow, like, now it's really happening. Now this is like one of those moments where we can't really look back to what we were doing before. So And then the other thing too is that I feel like because we're all, so much of our relationships now have had to happen through this box. And so I feel like social media, which, you know, when it first dropped in 2008, at least in my recollection, it was like really powerful. Facebook and all that was really powerful. It was really powerful to see all your friends from different time periods and hear all people's perspectives. And then it became mundane. And then I feel like because so much of our ability to interact is coming through this again, I feel like social media has kind of gained strength again, and it's gained vividness. And then when the situation with George Floyd happened, it was like people felt it. They didn't just go numb, they felt it. And everybody was paying attention because this was one of the main ways we're interacting.
And it doesn't seem like it's slowing down. Again, this like myriad crisis, this upheaval, this uncovering, this unveiling. Great. Let's jump deeper into it. So I want to turn to like our first question and take a deeper dive into this justice, racial justice conversation in this moment of time. Obviously, it's got a long history, goes all the way back. Our movement moment is building on so many, so much organizing, so many movement moments before. Today, we're on the eve of Juneteenth, honoring the official end of slavery in our nation. And yet just by like looking at the inequities connected to the COVID-19 health crisis and looking at the anti-police Black violence that we've been speaking about that has sparked so much of this moment, it's clear that we still have such a long ways to go towards Dr. King's, dream and towards this vision of beloved community, right? Towards this work of collective liberation. So yeah, I'd love to just invite y'all to share, like, how have these last few weeks been for you on a personal level, for your families, and then what are you seeing as the work, the opportunity, the questions, that we need to be asking right now to bring greater racial justice, really to move towards beloved community in this moment. And Theodore, I'm going to start with you again.
Yeah, I mean, from where I'm sitting, I should say that, I'm sitting here on the south side of Chicago, and this is unfolding. What's happened is unfolded in a very kind of intimate and personal way for me, considering all the unrest and uprising that's happened, and a combination of real mixed emotions about it for me, in that on the one hand, it's extraordinarily painful. Not that there's been, damage to property and things like that. That's not what's painful. What's painful is just to see, I think for many of us watching what unfolded with George Floyd specifically, but with many other people in many other circumstances, it's just like how obviously heinous the act was. And then to simply say what's obvious and say something is really, such a low bar as to say, stop killing people, that we matter, to say something as mundane as that is met with opposition is just really painful to watch unfold, So there's that pain, and it's just so obvious here from in the community where I'm at. It was so obvious just how much pain there was, and at the same time, I think there was, and also I should say that I have to like explain this to my children. We have to deal with this, right? So we have to we've had, my younger ones are sort of, they're 5 and 6, but my 12-year-old, like, she has to understand so many things about how to grow up in this world, in this country, that are really, painful to have to talk to her about. But on the other one of the things that you wouldn't know from watching the news, you wouldn't know that, like, while it's true that there's a lot of like anger and a lot of, you know, unrest and things happening, also there's so much care that I see in the community. I see so many people taking care of each other when they don't have enough to eat because of the pandemic and because everything's closed because of, you know, the unrest. So I see, you know, and I see a lot of inspiration from watching the leadership of young people who are really sort of standing up and showing us the way. And I my hope is that we keep listening to young people who are really like have so much energy in this uprising. So that's a really positive development, you know. And I think it has to be intergenerational. We have to cultivate like good relationships, but part of that has to be with older people, elders, beginning to listen to younger people, because younger people are actually leading in a lot of cases. And I think that's really inspiring to me. And as far as like, you know, going back to the question of like, why is it that, you know, the question that I think many of us keep asking ourselves is, why is it so hard to say that like, that a Black life matters as much as a white one? You know, like, why is it so hard? You know, and I think a piece of that is just how deeply this kind of dehumanization and dualism of Black and white is in American civilization, and just how American culture, just how the attachment to whiteness. I always go to James Baldwin, who says whiteness is a metaphor for power. And until people can let go of that attachment to that identity, I think that we will continue to have the same kind of devaluing of a Black life in this country. So that's really hard work. That's really hard work, because it's so deep in American civilization. And I wonder if it's even possible, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, first of all, I want to say that I'm on the Front Range, Colorado's Front Range, and this is traditional lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, the Ute. Some people say the Apache. This is like where the Sand Creek Massacre took place. And I'm living in a neighborhood, you know, that's like very wealthy. It's primarily white. It's like upwardly mobile in an almost aggressive way. And I have 3 children. And at our dinner table, we, you know, one of my sons is like, can we stop talking about politics? Because the discussions are just, we're just drilling to the bottom of it. And one of my daughters is in that moment of her life where she had to come back from college. And this is kind of skipping a little bit, but whatever, like she's in the coming of age moment. And she's really reflecting on how growing up in this area injured her in certain ways and put her in direct contact with the psychology, the mass psychology of whiteness in the United States. And so, you know, I've been feeling, first of all, just walking around the streets out here, like hyper visible. I feel hyper visible. I can almost feel people looking at me in cars. I can feel people park their car and they kind of like come out of their car to take a look at me, and almost like, you know. And on the plus side of it, I feel like most people, white people to be specific, I feel like there's a heart gesture, there's a reach, there's an actual curiosity. A lot of my white friends, and you've heard this and you've seen it, social media, and it's probably, it may have happened to you, right? But a lot of my white friends are like, how are you doing? How are you doing? How are you doing? And it's just interesting, right? And like, even if it, like there's maybe some kind of unskillfulness in it, I think the heart gesture is interesting and important. And, you know, and we went down to one of the marches in Denver, and we went to the Capitol, and it was held on the steps of the Capitol. And I hadn't been down there. My wife and daughter had been down a couple of times, and people had spray painted all over the Capitol. F this, F the police, F the mayor. They had shattered windows. The windows were boarded up. And I was just like, oh. I was like, oh. And honestly, it hurt. And then as I just sat there listening and looking, and it was mostly people who were in their 20s. It was mostly youth. And then at one point they asked all the black children to come up on stage. And just that, first of all, was real powerful, just to have these kids be honored and recognized in front of this larger community of the city. But then I also was really looking at this Capitol, and I was like, okay, so what does this Capitol represent? What do these statues that people are pulling down represent? And they represent the authority in the society. They represent and the police are supposed to be the enforcers of the authority of the society. They're supposed to make sure that we respect the rules, and they're supposed to make sure that we're safe. And we are supposed to be all of us if all lives are supposed to matter in this country. And so I feel like this is the second round of the Black Lives Matter movement asking this question: Are we part of all lives matter? Do we count in this? Because that's not what the behavior of the police and other systems in our society show us. And if it doesn't show us that we matter, then why should we respect your authority? It's not even for us. And it's not just Black youth that I feel like are in this situation. I feel like so many youth, and not just youth, our generation grew up with this same feeling, and the one before it did too, where it's like this authority, this Capitol building that is based on Roman architecture, it doesn't actually represent us. And if it doesn't represent us and it's sitting in this PowerPoint in the middle of the city, why should it even be there? So I just feel like there's this big question about are the authorities, are they doing what they say they're supposed to do? And I'm almost thinking about this from the perspective of fatherhood, and traditionally, father's supposed to be an authority in the house. And people are they're not accepting that anymore. And I think there's also a reclamation of as far as Black people, as far as Native people, as far as many peoples, of just your authority as a human being and your authority in your community.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it feels to me like, in addition, not only do those symbols kind of, it's not only are they not there for you, but they're also I mean they have a history of being actively antagonistic as well, right? You know what I mean? So it's if we really look at kind of how these structures were put into place, policing, for example, right? How that was the role it's always played in this country. It's not there's a tendency, I think, we have stories we tell about ourselves, about our country specifically, and the stories don't always match up with the reality that many people live, right? So the story is the police are there to protect you, and that that kind of thing, right? The actual history is much more complicated, or the actual history is much more cynical, I guess I would say, than that. I mean, the actual history of policing has always been as a way to control Black bodies in America. That's always been the role of policing in this country. And so I think until we can actually honestly say that and honestly address that reality, that's the only way for anything to actually begin to change, a Confederate hero statue, there's a whole narrative about this is celebrating, I don't know what people say about that, Southern culture or something. There's a reality that that person fought a war to protect slavery. So, if we can't be honest about what the history is there, then I think that's, and we can't begin to unpack the narratives that we've been given about these things, we can't deal with it at all, And I do think that being pushed as far, I think many young people feel really pushed to the edge, they have to do something, you know what I mean? Some older people maybe a little more comfortable, a little, you know what I mean? Don't quite, aren't willing to risk as much, or don't feel like they have more to lose. I think that young people feel like they don't have as much to lose and are willing to really, really push. And, you know, that's you know, that's really something to listen to, you know. You know, I felt like in the, you know, in the Democratic primaries, for example, for president, I feel like there was a real disconnect between the generations, between the elders and the young people, who were what they wanted. And we got to listen to the young people. It's not that they're always right, but we got to listen, you know.
Ramon, you're muted if you want to unmute yourself if you want to get in there.
Yeah, I don't really know what to say right now. I'm just like,
well, I want to move us into this conversation about young people. So for those of you joining us today, that's definitely one of the connecting points here, is that Theodore and Ramon are both visionary educators. They're youth workers, and they know that young people are leading the way, are showing the way, and they work in the broader education sector, right? So Theodore, you've been working with the Chicago Wisdom Project, and you've been working with teachers and schools, along with teens and young adults, for many years now. And Ramon, you're currently teaching at Naropa University, but you've been a facilitator and teacher within youth programs, including the Surfing the Creative work with Melissa Michaels and community, along with a number of youth programs. You've been a founding member of Youth Passageways, a network that's working to revitalize rites of passage culture and traditions and programs here in North America and around the world. Yeah, so you all bring a lot, and we're at this moment when you know, the education sector is being disrupted, and you know, I'm sure you all may be very attuned to the ways it was already failing and not working, and then now suddenly, bam, a pandemic, and then bam, you know, this moment of uprising too. Students, again, Ramon, like your daughter, but students of all ages are also like just asking these deep questions around like, wow, where are we? And what do I do? And how do I show up in these times? And do I go to school next year? And teachers are asking like, how do we respond to this moment? Like, how do we help our young people, you know, ask the right questions and get engaged and, you know, make sense out of it. So I just want to open up that space for us to shift into like talking about education. I think we have time to both talk, you know, about schools and teachers, and then also to get in kind of to the deeper conversation around young people and their role in our culture, their role at this particular moment.
Yeah, you know, if the problem is, if the crisis is a crisis that involves really our core values, our sense of who we are, our place in the world, then it's really a problem with education, I think, you know. And I don't just mean like, I don't mean, I'm not referring to things like, you know, and it involves this. Some of it involves things like teaching history more accurately, right? Like it involves some of that too. You know, I referred to that earlier. But what I'm talking about is the way in which, you know, we have a view of ourselves in the world, a worldview, and how that's cultivated and created and reinforced. And one of the primary ways it's expressed, I mean, these are things that we're not consciously taught, you know what I mean? What we do is we sort of digest these things in these subconscious ways, you know, whether it's through the television or through things our parents say to us or going to church, all different ways. One of the ways we do it is we go to school. And the thing about going to school is the deepest lessons we learn in school are not the specific curricular content that we're taught. It's actually the whole shape of the space. It's like it's all the unspoken things that happen in school. And what I mean by that is we can structure a school that's more kind of like egalitarian, in which people are listened to and they're taught that their voices matter and that they have agency, or we can structure a school that's hierarchical, and we can make it more kind of rigid, and we can teach people that their voices don't matter and that they have to only listen to the authority that is the teacher. You know, I think that essentially what I'm suggesting here is that a school or any learning space is a metaphor for the world. And I would suggest that the schools we have largely now, there are exceptions for sure. So, but I would say largely the schools we have right now are operating on metaphors that aren't really serving us well and are actually reinforcing these injustices in the world. Even if they have some kind of curricular content that is oriented towards social justice, if the actual shape and the patterns of learning and the relationships that are cultivated in the learning space aren't socially just relationships, we won't be teaching those lessons of social justice. I would argue that the schools we have today are largely based on the metaphor of the machine or the factory, which is like just simply teaching us that our world itself and we are actually machines or sort of mechanistic in our way of dealing with the world. And I think that if we look at how we're treating the planet right now, how we operate with the planet, I think that's a large part of the problem, is that we're not using organic metaphors. I also see that we really love the metaphor of the kind of like capitalist business metaphor. You know, like in Chicago, the head of the school is no longer the superintendent, it's the CEO, because we've been taught that corporations are more efficient, and that's like a better way to deliver education. And if we can just find like enough, you know, greater efficiency, we'll get higher test scores, and then everything will be better, right? It reinforces the notion that you're in a classroom not to learn together and to grow together and to take care of each other, but you're in a classroom to compete with each other and outdo each other. And that's by and large the metaphor that you find in most classrooms. And then another metaphor that I'll put out there is a metaphor of the prison, which is, it's been well documented how we have many schools that are kind of like oriented toward many of the students, preparing students to be part of the legal system. If we look at the kind of like excessively punitive way that we treat certain kinds of students, then it's not, you know, schools that have police in them. I mean, these relationships between police and the community they exist all the way from when you're in school. It's before you're even, you know, out of school. They happen in school. We have police in the schools. And oftentimes we have this like excessively punitive approach to learning and education, and it's always charged with sort of notions of class and race. You know, you don't see those kinds of attitudes in more privileged spaces in schools. So I use those metaphors as a way to suggest that the only way to move into a new way of really seeing the world is to actually change the metaphors that we're working on with our children. And that's really hard work. It's a lot harder than just sort of like, you know, signing a different book or something like that. But we have to really think deeply, I think, about what kinds of relationships we're cultivating in learning spaces. And I think that's much more important ultimately than anything else you can do for a child.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of the students I interact with, forgive me, y'all, there's a weed, somebody's blowing grass over there, weed whacking over there. A lot of the students I interact with, I think that there's both a feeling of overwhelm, you know, a lot of students feel like, why should I continue my studies when it really looks like the world's falling apart? Is this really the most important thing for me to be doing right now? And I also think that there is a strong desire to engage, you know, and like we're studying these issues in abstraction. And I think there's a strong desire on the part of a lot of the students to actually study and work, study and apply, study and have contact. And, to some extent, I feel like myself and some of the institutions I work with, we can meet that need, but generally not. I feel like generally I'm part of sending so much information their way. They're like, we can't process this, or we don't have the structure set up to really be in a study work or like a praxis type of relationship. And I think this kind of gets to what Theodore is saying as far as like, what is the metaphor that we are embodying in our institution? And I think especially students that are older, it's like, I mean, you're already an adult. By the time you get to college, there's a lot to learn, but you're an adult, and you get to a point where there's something inside of you that's set, and you have a certain confidence about how you go about the world. And we also have a lot of students that come in really injured and really fragmented, and really they're not there for the intellectual game. They're there for healing. And I think that that's something that we miss a lot, is that many of the students need healing. They need integration, and they need those kind of like foundational tools more so than they need more information. And then they need ways to apply the information. And so, yeah, I feel like on a whole, our institutions, I don't know if I can say on a whole, but from my experience, are not really set up for that, for the healing piece, and to accommodate these I guess it was in 2005, there was a study that came out of UCLA, I think, and they said that 2015, that cohort of high school graduates had report the highest levels of anxiety and depression of any cohort that they had, that they had measured, and they've been doing this study for 50 years. So it's like, as all of these different processes in our planet are breaking down, it's like, or if we're on overshoot, it's because human beings are on overshoot, right? We're moving too quickly, and then we're getting burnt out along with everything else. And so then the kids are coming in and they're burnt out, and they need rejuvenation and regeneration and healing and integration sometimes before they can even take in anything else, and definitely before they can act. And so, yeah. And then also there's some students that are starting to really look at the ways in which some of the institutions that I'm working with are just part of the landscape of white supremacy. And that's not a particular call out. That's not saying you're doing wrong and you're doing wrong. It's just that this is how the power of this society was built. And so many of the institutions are just embedded in it. And the students see that, like, okay, you're teaching me social justice with your mouth, but underneath, what are we really doing? So, yeah, I don't know.
You really hit on, I think, something that's really important to me in this talk about education. And I think it's kind of, it's really related to all of the crisis, and that we are a civilization that's very much fragmented, and we are we're kind of addicted to this sort of like, the tyranny of the quantifiable a lot of the time, and we focus so much on this notion of this overvaluing of passing on information, or even like discrete skills in education. And that's often, those things are somewhat important, but they're not far from the most important thing, for sure. So I think that if I could say one thing in which, how we can reimagine education, is moving from that sort of like real kind of like like honing in on this very, very narrow view of what learning and education can be, and thinking more holistically, you know. And that has to involve, you know, and you really hit on it, it has to involve the part about healing, you know. It has to. You know, I've read similar studies about, you know, kind of like this incredible anxiety and stress and depression in young people today. It's, you know, it's obviously a huge problem for all of us, and surely the pandemic isn't making it any better. You know, the hope is only that maybe it shines a light on it, because we're all stressed out and depressed maybe now. But the real, in my experience working with young people, the best way to actually get any kind of like learning outcome that you're looking for is to create a space and create a process and create a culture of care in the space, right? So to create a space where people actually start caring for themselves and for one another. And that makes the whole thing, it's like the opposite of the whole thing where we're in this like individualist capitalist competition with each other. It's the actual opposite of that. And really kind of paying attention to the element of trauma and stress and whatever else people are bringing into the classroom or into the learning space. You know, if we can't address those things, then, you know, the information that we impart will have at very best a diminished value to the people who are in there. You know, I mean, and speaking to like kind of like, how do you like take that information and go do something with it? How do you, you know, actually put it into place? Well, you know, that requires, you know, an energy behind actually doing work in the world, but it also requires kind of the focus on the whole person in order to get someone to a space where they're actually in a place where they can go out in the world and take information or skills they're given and do something impactful. You know, and part of that, one more thing I'll say about that kind of holistic piece is that it's not just about the whole individual. It's about the whole community. And it's about kind of breaking down that notion, that very notion of the isolated individual, which is, I think, kind of like the fundamental cosmological assertion in capitalist culture, that we are fundamentally isolated individuals, you know. Moving from that to thinking more ecologically, or more in the Buddhist sense, that we are actually deeply interconnected with each other, and thinking how we can kind of cultivate that sort of sensibility in people.
And if I could say just one little piece more with this question, you know, I feel like, Theodore, you were talking about like the whole person, and how do we cultivate the whole person and understand the whole person in a community context. And this is where I feel like we get into the conversation around initiation, right? And around rites of passage, and around like how do we start to restructure education, maybe all the way through, but definitely the later teens, the 20 and the early 20s. How do we start to structure education so that it's an initiatory experience, or we recognize the initiatory experience that you're going through at that time in your life? You know, because like when we say come of age, it's like, you know, when you have a small child, like they sit in the driver's seat of the car, but the structure of the car is too big for them. You know, they come up to the desk, but the desk only comes up to their eyes. And when you come of age, like your body and your mind is now in proportion with the way that the world has been built. And so now you are at a place where you can actually see what's happening, and then examine how you want to relate to it. You know, and that's what the university is supposed to do. That it's the university, and it's supposed to prepare people to live in the universe, mm-hmm. or hold a mirror up for them and help them see how they are already prepared or preparing to live in the universe. You know, so it's like the training is good, but like I feel like some of that can happen in the graduate level, right? When you've made up your mind and you're set and you've tried you've tried your spirit in the world in a way, and you say, I want that skill. But in the undergrad and that developmental moment there, it's like you want to be recognized for having gone through something, and you want to go through it with people. This is like my daughter right now. She's like in the most social phase of her life, and yeah, she's stuck at home with us.
Yeah.
And it's a hard time for young people right now. The high school graduates in our town, they had to drive around. They had to do like a parade, right? They missed high school graduation. They missed prom. Even these narrow rituals, rites of passage from that this mainstream society deals with, they missed that. So I don't know. It's like, like the people gathering in the street, that's a rite of passage experience. Or initiatory experience.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's the pandemic is hardest on that age group right now. It's hard on people who are alone. It's hard for a lot of different people for different reasons, but I think, man, it's really hard if you're at that phase, because what's most important is like being around your people and socializing at that phase. And there's it's funny that we have so much emphasis in our education systems on these, like, on getting people jobs, even like, I mean, we even for like kindergartners, we're thinking about how are they going to get jobs? That's like, that is the motivation. Like, how are they going to get jobs? Like kindergartners, right? Like, how are they going to get good test scores so they go to the next level so they can, you know what I mean? For an economy that we have no idea what it's going to be anyway. You know what I mean? Like, we don't know what jobs are going to be in 5 years, 1 year, much less, when my kindergartner is grown, right? So what's the point of education, right? So what's the purpose? And I think it's exactly what you said. It's like to discover one's place in the universe. That is a much better kind of framing of what the university ought to be. And that's a holistic process that requires like many aspects of self, and it has to be social, because that's how you learn, by sharing ideas with other people and bouncing those ideas. You know what I mean? We tend to think of it like a thing where it's like, I'm just like giving you a piece of information that you can own now, right? Like it's a commodity. But the learning happens in those kind of spaces in between conversation and where we're like interacting with each other. I would say I learned as much being in my dorm room as in college as I did in the classroom. You know what I mean? I mean, I learned a lot in the classroom too, but I think it's the holistic experience, and the question of how to create and recreate rites of passage is a huge one. It's hugely important. And I hope that the pandemic will inspire people to take it more seriously when we see kind of like what's being lost.
I want to invite us to shine a light on, so you were just speaking to the purpose of education, Theodore, and I just want to shine a little more light on like the purpose of young people, especially adolescents and young adults, and to connect it really directly with the process of reimagination, and cultural reimagination. And I know you both get this because it's who you are, it's what you do. But I think a lot of times in our society, we don't recognize the deeper nature of, young adulthood and kind of the purpose of even like the succession of generations, right? And how, history unfolds through waves of generations, and each new generation, it helps remake the world. It helps reimagine the world. And there's a way where it seems like almost like nature designed life that way, right? And nature designed the human species that way. And young people are therefore like this deep gift, of again, helping take us further, helping us see with a new perspective. So I just would love to hear your own voices on that. Like what's your understanding of the purpose of young people? How does that connect up with reimagination? And then especially in this time when young people are like questioning, like, oh, should I go to school, or what should I do? I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like, what are activities and things that they might engage in, be it directly with schools or not, to support their process of reimagining right now. for the benefit of life, for the benefit of our culture moving forward?
Well, I'll say that, I'm glad you asked the question. I think it's because I think it's so useful to really think about how it is that a different generation from one's own could have something to offer and to learn from. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I think that's one of the many ways that our civilization is fragmented. It's fragmented generationally. You know what I mean? I would even argue that, like, from an educational perspective, like, there's, why do we have to group people in these, like, very rigid age groups? You know what I mean? I think people learn a lot from being around different age people and learning from each other and sharing and learning from different generations. We certainly don't honor our elders as we should in our society. But to speak specifically to young people, we don't honor young people either. I think generally there's a tendency to sort of dismiss young people as being, all the kind of stereotypical ways that we dismiss young people. But I think that, for one, and I think this particular generation now of young adults, people who are like around, Ramon's daughter who's in college, and maybe, people in their 20s, are really showing us that, for a variety of reasons, because of their life experiences, because the world they were born into, which is different from the world I was born into, they have something to teach us, and they're really showing us something with all of the kind of unrest. I'll add to that I think there's a specific way in which young people change our world, and I think it's something that we all ought to tap into as much as we can. And that is that the real thing that I learned from my own children, of all different ages, is what they do is that they play. That's the main function that's why they're here. They're here to play. And, and what does play mean? It means that, like, every day they get up way earlier than I would like them to, the little ones, right? My 5 and 6 year old, and they, like, create a whole world, create a world that will be destroyed by noon, and then they'll create a new world. They're just playing. That's their whole reason to be here, and they don't have an assignment. No one's told them to do this. They know this. They already know this. They have that all that wisdom of how to create a whole world and unpack it and recreate it every day. They have that. And so the lesson there is that while we may not retain all of that youthful playfulness that my 5 and 6 year old possess, we need to learn from that. Just like we need to learn. I mean, when I look at the protests, when I look at the unrest that's happening, that's play. When people take not just knock a statue down, but when they spray paint it, when they put all different language on it, when they, that's play. Protest is play. And that's the thing that we have to learn in order to recreate the world. We have to learn how to play. If we're too caught up in, like, the kind of rigidity of adulthood, then we're not going to do the real deep work of reimagining our world. And that's the gift of youth, I think. But we can all be youthful, though. Just because we're a little older doesn't mean we can't be youthful.
Beautiful. Potent. Ramon, what you got?
Yeah. I really seeing a human being go from like a pea pod to a fully extended, upright, intelligent, mobile being, and, like, listening to the music now, like, my kids are like I have the music I like, right? But, like, new music, it's my kids. They're like, listen to this. At first I was like, dude, turn that off. Like, stop that. Or are you listening to what they're saying there? And now I'm like, oh, wait, who's that? Wait, who? And so I really, really feel now that, like I feel like, as like, historically, the beam of energy that was initiated in the, late 1950s through early 1970s, that beam I feel like in a way we are still working that beam out. But I also feel like our generation, Generation X, it was like we grew up in the afterglow of that, and we also grew up, it was like a bomb that didn't blow up. You know, we were expecting something and it didn't quite go all the way through. And then the millennials, you know, they have their own kind of orientation, but whatever they call them, Gen Z or whatever, these kids, that time period is cold to them. They don't get any of that after warmth now. They're just seeing what they're seeing. And so on one hand, I feel like the older generation's responsibility is to kind of carry the continuity of the story so far. This is what has happened. You know, this is what we're working on. This is what we struggle with. This is where we messed up. You know, this is where we don't know. And to like, because, you know, I've heard from the millennials, well, you guys messed up the world and now we have to carry it. And it's like, nah, that's not really true, totally. I mean, yes, it's true, but it's also like people have been doing the work for decades, if not for centuries. And so at a certain point, you consent to take up the work, you know? But at the same time, each generation, and I think especially like you might say there's beginning, middle, and end generations. And I think the kids who are coming of age now are a beginning generation. Like they're beginning again and they have a fresh view and they have a fresh approach to organizing and they're ready to try forms of leadership that we were all kind of like, or we like developed, like it took us a long time to develop them, but we couldn't quite embody them and they just grab it and they just controlling that thing, you know? Like people are talking about like defund the police. And I'm like, that causes me shivers. But I think that there are a lot of and my daughter's explaining it to me. She's like, this is what they're talking about, Dad. So I feel like each generation comes up and they see things with fresh eyes, and then they learn to take on the story of the previous generations, and then they decide how they're going to relate to it, and then take it forward. And for this generation, this is the moment. Like no one is going to forget 2020, and especially the kids that are coming of age right now. They're not going to forget 2020. So
I'm not going to forget 2020.
Good.
It's going to be before 2020 and after 2020. I think that's how, and I see like with my, you know, my little ones, I don't know if they're totally tuned. My 12-year-old, like, you know, like all of your children, like it's going to be like, this is going to be like that big moment, you know what I mean? And she's, you know, not there yet because she's pretty young, but she's inheriting, you know, this energy and this movement, you know, that's happening. It's you know, it's as a Gen X person, it's really interesting to watch like how kind of focused and organized people are, you know? And I think that, you know, as you put it, it certainly, there's been a pillaging, I think, of our democracy, which we were taught, like I was taught growing up like in the 80s, that, you know, there was this thing called progress and that we were progressing, you know what I mean? Like it was getting better. And some things have gotten better for sure, you know? But simultaneously there was like a pillaging of democracy, I think, that's happened. And you know, it's for every step forward, it feels like there's been a few steps back. And I think that, you know, part of what's happened is young people don't, you know, you're talking about young people don't know if they should be in college or not, or if it's worth it, you know. That's much more of a kind of thing nowadays because people aren't really sure what the purpose is, you know what I mean? But maybe the purpose is to just be out in the streets right now, and that's a beautiful thing, I think, you know. If we can listen. I do worry that, you know, if I'm being honest, like, you know, I know some wonderful elders who do listen, and I also know some elders who aren't really ready to listen to what 20-year-olds have to tell them. You know what I mean? So it's important to listen, I think.
Beautiful. Thank you both. And Theodore, thank you for just starting this segment of our conversation with such clarity around the call to honor our elders and the call to honor young people, and yeah, and of course, like the wisdom that sparks between all generations, right? When we come together and show up in these times. I want to bring us into our final question. And so we're in this like turning point moment, 2020, right? Vision and radical reimagination. And another gift you all bring is like a deeper time perspective. And it's something I really, I love about you both. You're philosophers, you're mystics, and you think at like the biggest levels. And I guess I want to invite us to deepen into that conversation around like what is the deeper cultural change you see happening, and this is probably change, right? That's been underway for quite some time. It's probably change that's going to continue unfolding here in the 21st century. Theodore, you already started to kind of presence it when you're talking about like what's really at the core of the worldview, the operating system, right? Shaping our way of being human. And just want to open it up to hear like what's your understanding about that kind of deeper change that's happening. What is your understanding of human identity as it's been, and maybe human identity as where we're going? How do you see that unfolding? How can we support that kind of deeper reimagining of what it means to be human and our relationship with all of life, with nature, with the universe itself?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a big question that I won't fully answer, but I'll offer a few thoughts. And I think that, I'd start with, I think, this idea that is kind of, has serves a purpose, an economic purpose, which is the notion that we're fundamentally individuals. Are fundamentally kind of competing with each other. And I mentioned it in relationship to how it plays out in school, but schools are just, spaces that serve as microcosms of the broader civilization. And the idea is that we're competing with each other. We're ultimately responsible for what's happened to us. Something I've done with I've done with a lot of young people who come out of like kind of, really like traumatic experiences. Is we do this exercise in which we kind of take a look at something that's happened, or which largely has been framed to them as the consequence of their own poor decisions. Okay. And we take a look at that incident, and like the incident that we talked a lot about in this one class that I was teaching these were a group of young men, largely young men, who had dropped out of high school, right? And they had been told over and over again that the reason they dropped out of high school was because of a series of bad choices they'd made, right? So when we began to take a look at that and really unpack that a little bit, we started to think, well, okay, so who am I then? I'm this individual, and I make choices about my life. We all make good and bad choices. But I'm also like a part of a family, a part of a neighborhood, a part of a community, a part of a society. And we begin to look at those other levels. We begin to see that actually the individual choices we made are only a small part of what's happened to us. We're actually in this web of all these different relationships. And if we really think of ourselves in a more expansive way, we begin to recognize that, yes, we do have some agency. We make some decisions that are either good or bad, but also we're so deeply connected to other people's decisions that we're not entirely responsible, good or bad, for what's happened to us. So I think I'd start with that. I'd start with that notion that we are these isolated individuals competing with one another. And I think about it much more in the sense of we are actually connected to each other, and we are in relationship with each other. And I think if we begin to think about and explore that notion, which can't be done on an entirely intellectual level, it requires a lot of work to move from that way of thinking to one way of thinking to the other. I think that what's revealed to us is that so much of what's happening in the world is our own responsibility, and that we are at least partly our responsibility. We're really sort of just on this island planet floating through space together, and that we're really in this together. And thinking about that kind of shift in mentality would be kind of a starting point for me, just thinking about how we can move from the hyper individualism of really capitalist worldview to the more interconnected ecological way of thinking about the self.
Yeah, I mean, man, in a way, there's so many things going through my mind. I'm just like, wow, okay. Because yeah, this time has just brought up so much. And I feel like we are really at one of those strike the iron or strike the hammer while the iron is hot moments. And where we can really bend things, you know. So I don't know. I want to throw out like three lenses that have been up for me. The first is like, kind of, I don't know, I'm kind of coming from like on some of those from like biblical traditions, right? Whether it's like Christianity or Judaism or Rastafari, like those are teachings that have been influential. And like one saying of Jesus is, you can't put new wine in old wineskins. And I feel like that's such the situation of the society. It's like, there's a new wine, like people are ready for a bigger life. They're ready for a more abundant life. They're ready for a more fulfilling life. They're ready to show love at a greater frequency. And I mean that almost like, and yet I think so many people feel stymied in the ability to do that because the institutional structures don't exist to prism that love through. You know what I mean? Like you spend all of your time trying to figure out how to make a living and keep food on the table, and you burn out a lot of your life energy that you would want to give to not to other things, but in another way. And then, another thing that a lens that I work with is like astrology. And that might be going pretty far out for some people on the call, but maybe not. I mean, it's time to say the weird stuff, right? Like, and if you're an astrology fan, if you're interested in that, in the Capricorn area of the chart right now, there's a lot of activity. And Capricorn represents like the solid stuff of life. It's an earth sign. It's about the tangible. It's about the tangible at scale. It's about banking. It's about finance. It's about land ownership. It's about authority. It's about control. And it's about wielding control over the earth plane. And there's a lot of activity happening in that part of the chart right now. And basically it's like one of the messages is that way of doing our control of the earth plane, that structure that we've done as a society, is undergoing the death process. And so you can see it, like COVID did it. For a second, we were like it was like business as usual is invincible. It's like no matter what, the economy is going to keep going. And for a moment, we had to push pause on it. And it showed us that we could push pause on it. And it showed us what parts of the economy are parts that we can't do without, and what parts of the economy we could stand to not do them or redirect energy to something else. And so and then the last one is like, I've been thinking a lot about Teilhard de Chardin, his idea of the noosphere, and like this idea that humans are part of building this like intelligence network, this nervous system, this soul, some people might say, of the earth, or maybe enunciating what's already there. And I feel like it's kind of like, I feel like the fact that we're not in physical space with one another as much, and that and the social web is stretched out, and then the fact that we're having to channel so much culture through these things now, it's like, I mean, think about it. Like when COVID hit, by like March, if you could, I'm kind of going far out, but if you could, like, if every emotion was a color, and you could look over the whole earth, you would probably, and let's say fear was green, you would see a lot of green come up when COVID hit. And I feel like people are all over the earth are in a similar emotional space right now. And then, so when George Floyd's murder hit, people in New Zealand were like, they were watching, people were already on a similar vibe, and they were like, bow. You know, so it's like paradoxically, as it's driving us more apart, it's actually creating space for us to be more together in the immaterial. And now it could very easily shut down and everybody could be isolated in their own bubble, and it could work for fascism very easily. But I think it's allowed that potential for us to feel each other at a distance and to communicate at a distance, and to, you know, people all over the world are like, yo, the police killings of Black people in the United States is happening. It's real. It's messed up. And it needs to stop. And so people are all concentrating on one thing. And I think this is like pushing that noosphere into becoming a stronger reality.
You know, I feel like there's even more at play when I was thinking about when you were talking about the one thing that was super inspiring for me was like seeing how people in Paris and people in South Africa and people in all these different countries were like standing up like for what was going on here. You know what I'm saying? And you know, and I was thinking like, what's going on there? Like, why is this resonating so much? I mean, some of it is like the obvious, just kind of horror at what they had seen in a video. You know what I mean? Probably compounded by people's kind of mental states with the pandemic going on. But you know, I also think there's some sense that the absolute power of the United States, that there was a pushback against the absolute power of the United States and its role on the planet today, and the direction that things are going in on the planet today, and how influential this government is in complicit in many of the injustices, not just here, but worldwide. I think that the government here is, and I think there's some pushback on that for sure at play. You know, I also wanted to say that, you know, I feel like, you know, as I think a lot about kind of like the role that we have, you know, we're in this space here, we're in these boxes looking at each other. And I think we're able to have a certain connection because of the way that we're interfacing through this medium. You know, it feels to me like there's a certain depth in this interaction, you know? And then I also feel like there are a lot of interactions we have that are so superficial, you know what I mean? Like I think about this notion of like, how everything is like through we're interacting, so much of our interactions are mediated, and they're mediated through these algorithms. And I often think about how we tend to interact with people in a way that is two-dimensional, that lacks like the dimension of depth. You know, we're just like on these flat screens all the time. And I think that, you know, I wonder how we can sort of like, when we talk about what's the new kind of worldview or new way of being in the world that is emerging. And I think it's for me, I talk a lot about the texture of the world. Like, how do we feel the texture of the world? You know, how do we actually suffer with and encounter suffering in a genuine way, without taking a pill to avoid the suffering? You know, without only encountering other people in a mediated space, and the kind of vulnerability and pain that sometimes is required to really encounter the world. It's easier to sell things to people who are isolated and who are thinking in terms of only kind of two dimensions and not thinking of depth. And I think that's why we have, you know, it's so kind of lucrative to have people, you know, interacting on Twitter, or on Facebook or on Instagram. And we have to do that now, you know, and it's a beautiful thing. We can still connect to people now. But I wonder if there's a way in which we can really kind of like begin to encounter one another's subjectivity in a way, you know, and both have the kind of breadth of connection that we're afforded through these, you know, through this new media, but also kind of some of the depth that perhaps we don't have as much as we could.
So are you saying, like, how do we communicate depth through these media, or like, how do we go beyond them and in our 3D relationships?
Yeah, maybe both. Yeah, maybe both. I think that you know, I think that it's hard to have, like, you know, the kind of I think our relationships tend to be increasingly superficial. Not because of the pandemic specifically. You know? I actually think the pandemic in some ways has brought up a lot, like for me anyway, I can speak for myself, like it's brought up a lot of, like, you know, really intense emotions and like connections to what's going on in the world beyond me, even though I'm not able to go out much. But I do think, like, sort of generally, as I observe kind of the culture and the way the direction in which it's moved, it feels like there are a lot of kind of superficial interactions that happen, you know, that don't necessarily have the real kind of felt sense of the fullness of what other human beings and other life forms are experiencing. And I think that requires, like, a real vulnerability to do that.
Thank you both. Let me jump in here and sound a few notes, and then I'm going to turn it back to y'all for some closing comments. We're in our final stretch. So much is still alive, so many questions, so many possibilities we're living into. I want to highlight, there was a question around, like, how do we connect these deeper reflective questions, you know, with also this, like, this timely moment of, like, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, and, you know, just again, the iron is hot, right? There's so much just that we can break through now. And I guess I just want to invite that question and that tension, you know, like, I see this is a time of great rest for many. Like, there is a time of, like, we're having more rest and reflection because we're still dealing with COVID. And then clearly it's a time of incredible unrest, and we're out on the streets, and we need to show up together, because it's through that showing up, being out there on the streets, that actually we are making progress. We are pushing forward in ways that we haven't done before. And yet that deeper conversation that you both just been speaking to needs to live with us too. You know, we need to always be digging deep and reaching far together. So I want to thank everyone for your comments and the resources and the questions there. Theodore and Ramon too. Again, we won't get to them all, but feel free to check them out. We are going to be sharing with everyone who signed up. We will share an email where you can stay in touch with both Theodore and Ramon. And I'm just going to throw some links for some of Theodore's websites on there for folks who want to go and learn more about your work and your books. This conversation, again, is part of something called Medicine for These Times, and we're hosting a wide array of timely conversations. A week from today, there's a conversation happening called We Keep Us Safe, from policing and prisons to care and community. And we're really going to be diving deep into the defund police movement and the reimagining and the reinvesting that's happening there on the ground. But there's a lot happening, and I know you both are up to good things too. And so we'll make sure in our follow-up email to share that. And the recording of this conversation will be sent out in the next couple of days too. So you'll be able to go and watch. If there were parts of this that really just sparked for you, you can revisit that and share with others. We're loving all the thanks and gratitude. Theodore and Ramon, the medicine of who you are is so needed. The work you do with young people, with educators, in the communities that you walk in and work in is so vital. So thank you for who you are, for everything you're up to, and just want to turn it back to you all for some final comments before we say goodbye to our friends.
I just want to say thank you. I really enjoyed talking to both of you, and I'm really always excited to connect to people. So if you find contact information through the website or whatever website it is that you find, please reach out. I'm always excited to make more connections and learn from other people. Wanted also to honor, I think Tree Turtle is somewhere here, and I want to honor that the work I do is and I'm not sure if anyone else from the Baltimore Wisdom Project, and that's our kind of sister, if that's the right word, organization. We work together as a single entity called Wisdom Projects, but Tree's work is really I want to honor Tree's work too. If you are still here, Tree. But either way, so that's another thing you can learn about is the Baltimore Wisdom Project, which is kind of connected to the Chicago Wisdom Project. Yeah, so I'm happy to connect to people, and I'm just grateful for both of you today. Thanks.
Yeah, my part of the world is starting to rain. And I looked on the line here. I got family on the line. One of my brother's wife's family, and also just been seeing a lot of the comments, and didn't necessarily address a lot of them, but people ask questions about, is it right to approach Black people as a white person, or like what's the highest purpose, or like how do we, what kind of curriculum would you suggest for adolescents? Not, and I see a lot of people put in like links there, but I really feel like everybody, like I feel like in your situation, like just looking at the context of your situation, your call may be to protest, or it may be to work with your school or with your business or with your neighborhood. It may be that you don't talk to, if you're white, you don't talk to Black people, you talk to white people, actually. That might be an interesting turn, and it may, and look at how many organizations said we're down for Black lives. Like, if we really look at that, NFL, right? And if we really look at these organizations saying, well, yes, we are, and then you take a look at what like Black Lives Matter and many other entities are saying that they, what their like kind of core principles or pushes for change are, I think what you can see is you can see the seed of nonviolent institutions. And I feel like as much as possible, if we can amplify that and make concrete pictures of like, what does it look like? And bring those to the different organizations and social spaces that you're in. If you say you're down, well, how could we try to apply this with our circle of influence, our circle of power? What steps could we make towards that? Because yeah. Anyway, I don't know what else to say, but just to look at your situation and look at some of the calls for change that are happening, and it's not just with racial justice. There's food justice. There's sustainability. There's cosmology and whatnot. And like, this is a moment to bring them to people and say, what step can we make towards that? So thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Theodore. It's really good to meet you. Hope to meet you in person. Thanks everybody for listening, and all power to everybody out in all your sectors.
All right, beautiful friends.
So they say love is the way. Listen the world, I hope I see you again someday. In isolation, trying to find the right words to say. to the rest of the world. From Oakland to the rest of the world. I love you.